Something massive just happened, and the mainstream media is either burying the details or spinning them so fast you can barely catch your breath. A 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran is now in effect, brokered not by the United Nations, not by any European power, but by Pakistan, a country that most Western analysts barely mentioned when this war first erupted on February 28, 2026. And the peace talks, the actual negotiations that could determine whether the Middle East stabilizes or descends into something far worse, are set to begin this very weekend in Islamabad. Think about what that means. The center of global diplomacy has shifted almost overnight, away from Washington, away from Brussels, away from every institution we were told would manage the world's crises. And if you sit with that for a moment, really sit with it, you begin to realize that what just happened is not simply a pause in bombing. It is a signal, a loud and unmistakable signal that the architecture of global power is being rearranged right in front of us, and most people are not seeing it for what it truly is. This ceasefire halted 40 days of US-Israeli attacks on Iran that had pushed the entire region to the brink of a wider war. 40 days. That is not a skirmish. That is a prolonged military campaign that disrupted global shipping, sent energy prices to record highs, and put the world's most critical waterway, the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil and gas passes during peacetime, under effective Iranian blockade. This was a geopolitical earthquake, and yet so much of the conversation in American media remained trapped in the language of winning and losing, of strength and weakness, of who blinked first. That framing misses everything that actually matters. Let me take you through this slowly, because the sequence of events leading up to this ceasefire reveals something profound about how power actually operates in the world today, and why the country sitting at the center of all this is one that most Americans have never seriously thought about in geopolitical terms. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and military chief Asim Munir had visited the White House back in September 2025, meeting Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. That visit at the time seemed routine. A diplomatic courtesy call. Nobody was writing headlines about Pakistan reshaping the Middle East. But behind the scenes, something was being built. A channel, a line of trust between Islamabad and Washington on one side, and between Islamabad and Tehran on the other. Pakistan, a Muslim-majority nuclear state with deep ties across the Islamic world, with a complicated but functional relationship with both the United States and Iran, was quietly positioning itself as the only actor capable of bridging a gap that no one else could cross. From March 22 to 23, officials confirmed that Pakistan's Army Chief Munir spoke directly to Trump. The US president had already announced a 5-day pause on strikes targeting Iranian energy infrastructure by then, signaling he was open to a diplomatic exit. On March 23, Pakistan formally offered to host talks, and here is where it gets interesting, because this was not a smooth, linear process. It was messy and dangerous and almost fell apart multiple times. On March 25th, Pakistan and China delivered a 5-point initiative for peace, calling for an immediate cessation of all hostilities and allowance of humanitarian assistance in the region. Iran at that stage was not exactly in a cooperative mood. On March 30th, the Iranian Foreign Ministry acknowledged that they had been holding indirect talks with the US through the mediation of Pakistan, but called the current American positions excessive and unreasonable. So you had a war actively being fought, Iranian missiles flying, American and Israeli strikes hitting targets across Iran, the Strait of Hormuz functionally shut down, global oil markets in panic, and at the same time you had this parallel diplomatic track running through Islamabad, fragile and contested but alive. That is the part the cable news channels cannot seem to convey. War and diplomacy are not opposites that take turns. They run simultaneously, each one shaping the other, and the people who understand that, the ones managing both tracks at once, are the ones who ultimately determine the outcome. On April 5th, Trump threatened to attack Iran's power plants and bridges if the Strait of Hormuz was not reopened within 2 days. On April 6th, indirect talks involving Iran and the US, mediated by Pakistan in Islamabad, led to a proposal for a 45-day ceasefire. Iran rejected the ceasefire, calling instead for a permanent solution to the war, and Iran's counter-proposal was not a vague gesture. Iran's 10-point proposal for peace called for Iranian oversight of the Strait of Hormuz, the withdrawal of US combat forces from the Middle East, and a halt to military operations against allied armed groups, among other demands. These are not small asks. These are structural demands that touch the entire architecture of American military presence in the region. When you read that list, you understand why the White House initially called it insufficient. But here is what Trump also said. He called the Iranian proposal a significant step, adding that almost all of the various points of past contention have been agreed to between the United States and Iran. That statement alone should have been front-page news everywhere. Almost all points agreed, from a man who just days before had threatened that a whole civilization would die. And then came Easter Sunday. As Pope Leo XV called for peace from the Vatican, Trump issued a stark warning on Truth Social, writing that Tuesday would be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day all wrapped up in one in Iran, threatening to blow up all of Iran's bridges and power facilities if the Strait of Hormuz was not reopened. Iran dismissed the remarks publicly, but behind the scenes, Pakistani officials intensified their diplomatic efforts. This is the rhythm of this kind of diplomacy. Public escalation, private de-escalation. The threats are not always disconnected from the negotiations. Sometimes the threat is the negotiation, a way of establishing pressure, of communicating urgency, of giving the other side something to respond to that preserves their domestic credibility while moving toward a deal. You cannot understand what happened in that final 90-minute window before Trump's deadline without understanding this dynamic. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif called on both Trump and the Iranian regime to agree to a 2-week ceasefire to give time for peace talks, with the statement coming less than 5 hours before Trump's self-imposed deadline to either get a deal or launch a massive bombing campaign on Iranian infrastructure, and the response from Washington was not an immediate yes. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the president had been made aware of the proposal and that a response would come. Those hours in between, the silence from Washington while the clock ticked down, must have been extraordinary. Diplomats in Islamabad, generals on the phone, envoys shuttling messages, the entire fate of a potential catastrophe balanced on a few hours of communication. Trump ultimately wrote on Truth Social that based on conversations with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir, who requested that he hold off the destructive force being sent that night to Iran, and subject to Iran agreeing to the complete, immediate and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz, he agreed to suspend the bombing and attack of Iran for a period of 2 weeks. And then came the Iranian confirmation. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed Tehran's acceptance and said Iran would allow safe passage of the Strait of Hormuz during those 2 weeks via coordination with Iran's armed forces. Now, if you only read that at face value, you might think the story is over. Deal done, guns quiet, everyone goes home. But that would be a profound misreading of where things actually stand, because this ceasefire is not a resolution. It is an opening, and a fragile one. Iran's Supreme National Security Council described the ceasefire as a victory while warning that its hands remain on the trigger. Key differences remain unresolved, and expectations for the upcoming talks are cautious. And then there is Israel. While Israel endorsed the Pakistani-brokered ceasefire with Iran, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said it would not extend to its fighting with Hezbollah or Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon. Netanyahu's comments seem to contradict Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif's claims that the ceasefire included a halt to Israel's attacks on Lebanon. This contradiction is not a minor footnote. It is a structural flaw in the entire arrangement, because Iran has made absolutely clear that the Lebanese front is not separable from the Iranian one in their strategic calculus. Araghchi warned that Tehran could abandon the ceasefire if Israeli strikes continue, saying the US must choose between a ceasefire or continued war via Israel. So, what you have is a ceasefire that one of the most important parties to the conflict, Israel, does not fully recognize as binding on its own behavior. That is an enormous problem for the talks in Islamabad, because if Israel continues striking Lebanon, and Iran views that as a violation of the ceasefire terms, then the entire diplomatic structure collapses. The greatest threat to any ceasefire in the region, as one analyst noted, remains Israel, which prefers ambiguous ceasefire deals that allow it to return to fighting when the situation favors the Israeli army. And yet, despite all of this fragility, despite the contradictions and the unresolved demands and the Israeli question hanging over everything, the talks are happening. Vice President Vance is set to lead the US delegation at peace talks with Iran in Pakistan, the highest level meeting between the US and Iran since the 1979 revolution. Let that land for a moment, since 1979. Nearly half a century of severed diplomatic relations, of proxy conflicts, of sanctions and hostility and mutual demonization, and now the second highest official in the United States government is sitting down with Iranian representatives in the Pakistani capital. Whatever happens next, that is an historic fact that cannot be undone. Prime Minister Sharif is expected to formally host the talks and hold separate preliminary meetings with both sides, with Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar, who has been involved in shuttle diplomacy throughout the conflict, expected to facilitate the actual negotiations. The architecture of these talks is itself revealing. Pakistan is not just providing a venue, it is actively structuring the conversation, managing the sequencing, deciding who meets who and when. That is the role of a genuine mediator with real leverage, not a passive host. Analysts noted that Pakistan's role marks a significant shift. A country that was not at the table for talks that resulted in the 2015 Iran nuclear deal or the Abraham Accords has now positioned itself at the center of a major diplomatic effort. As one expert put it, this is the first time Pakistan has simultaneously managed active conflict mediation between two adversaries under ongoing military escalation without direct contact between them. That sentence deserves to be read twice. First time in history. And it happened not because of some grand strategic vision announced in advance. It happened because the established institutions failed, because the usual mediators lacked credibility with one or both sides, and because Pakistan had something nobody else had: trust, or at least functional working relationships, with both Washington and Tehran simultaneously. This is what a multipolar world actually looks like in practice. It does not announce itself with a press conference or a formal declaration. It emerges in moments of crisis, when the old mechanisms break down and new actors step into the vacuum. The United Nations was not the solution here. The European Union was not the solution here. The G7 was not the solution here. Pakistan, China, and a set of back-channel relationships built over months of careful, unglamorous diplomacy provided the off-ramp that prevented a catastrophe. Now think about what Iran actually wants coming into these negotiations. Iran's 10-point proposal includes Iranian oversight of the Strait of Hormuz, the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the Middle East, a halt to military operations against allied armed groups, the lifting of sanctions, and reconstruction. These demands, read as a list, sound maximalist to American ears, but read them as a statement of strategic interest, and they begin to make a different kind of sense. Iran is a country that has been under sanctions for decades, that has watched its allies in Lebanon and Syria be degraded and dismantled, that has seen its supreme leader killed in the opening days of this war, that has watched its nuclear facilities be targeted repeatedly. From Tehran's perspective, the 10-point plan is not an opening bid designed to be negotiated down. It is the minimum conditions under which they believe peace is sustainable. The White House has instead claimed Iran is willing to surrender its stock of enriched uranium, a position spokesperson Levitt described as a non-negotiable American demand. Iran has not officially accepted that it is ready to give up its enriched uranium, and here is where the negotiations could fracture, because the gap between what Washington says Iran has agreed to and what Tehran says it has agreed to is enormous. This is not just a messaging problem. It reflects a fundamental difference in what each side understands the purpose of these talks to be. America seems to be framing this as Iran's capitulation dressed up in diplomatic language. Iran seems to be framing this as the beginning of a comprehensive restructuring of the Middle East security order. Those two framings cannot easily coexist in the same negotiating room, and yet here we are. The talks are beginning. The guns are, for now, quieter. The Strait of Hormuz, through which the world's energy supply flows, is nominally open. By April 9th, there was no sign that the agreement to lift the Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz was being fully implemented, with ships once again being prevented from moving through the strait, and Israel and the United States being accused of violating the ceasefire with attacks in Lebanon. So even as the talks begin, the conditions the ceasefire was supposed to create are already under strain. What does all of this mean for you, sitting here in America, watching this unfold? It means that the world your children will inhabit is being negotiated right now in a city most Americans cannot locate on a map, between delegations who understand that the old rules no longer apply. It means that the price of oil, the stability of global shipping routes, the nuclear question in the Middle East, the future of American military presence across the region, all of it is on the table in Islamabad this weekend. And the outcome is genuinely uncertain. What we do know is this: the use of overwhelming military force did not produce a decisive outcome. 40 days of strikes, American and Israeli air power deployed at scale, and the result is a negotiated ceasefire brokered by a third country, with Iran still standing, still demanding, still insisting on terms that go far beyond anything Washington publicly said it was prepared to accept. That is not a statement about blame or morality. It is a statement about what military force can and cannot accomplish in the modern world, in a region where the political costs of capitulation are existential for every leader involved. The peace talks in Islamabad may succeed, they may fail, they will almost certainly be agonizing and slow and filled with moments where everything seems about to collapse. But the fact that they are happening at all, that two countries which have not spoken at this level since 1979 are now sitting in the same room under Pakistani mediation while the world watches, tells you something fundamental about the moment we are living through. The old world is not simply declining, it is actively being replaced in real time by something new, something whose shape we cannot yet fully see. And the choices made in Islamabad in the coming days will do more to determine that shape than almost anything else happening on Earth right now.